Welcome, everybody, to the last in a series of Don't Panic webinars regarding the new mandate for skilled nursing facilities in California. This webinar will be devoted to the finance aspects of this question. Before we get started, I wanted to go through a few housekeeping items. First of all, we will be recording this webinar for purposes of further use in the future. If you don't wish to be recorded, feel free to log off, but by staying on, we'll presume your consent to being recorded. Second of all, I would like to thank the Goalpost team as well as Mazzetti for hosting and organizing these webinars and managing them as I speak and as our participants speak. And then thirdly is if you can put questions into the Q&A or chat function, we'll ask to hold your questions. Please put them in as we go, but we'll hold on answering your questions until the end in the interest of getting through the entire discussion and giving everyone a chance to ask questions. At the end, we'll have a discussion time. I'm hoping at least 20 minutes of discussion. So with that said, we'll jump in. So this is all about navigating the new California mandate for 96 hours of alternate power source for skilled nursing facilities. As we said, this is about financing your project and how to cut operational expense with rapid CapEx or capital expense recovery. Just for the sake of completeness, my picture is obviously in the upper right, but on the bottom left is our Faraday's current installation of batteries at the Kaiser, Ontario campus. That's about 9 megawatt hours of battery, and I put in solar. That is not our solar that's installed there, but that is nonetheless just an example of what can be done. I do want to give an advisory up front as we are discussing finance. I do want to say that we're not advising people on specific situations. You should read this advisory while I'm speaking to it. I won't read it out loud to you. We just want to be clear that the discussion here is just that. It's a discussion and illustrations, but each specific facility or situation is unique and should be analyzed. And more importantly, you should consult with competent professionals in this regard. So as we know, there's this new requirement for 96 hours of power. Unfortunately, that's an unfunded mandate. And as it's currently written into the law, it's due January 1st of this coming year. So we have 3 different approaches that we can take to this that have been discussed in previous webinars. And by the way, for those of you that didn't necessarily have the opportunity to hear about the technical aspects of this, those webinars will be available for your perusal, and you can learn about what the HCI requirements or approaches are. In terms of summary of those and how those might be approached, first there's that you could have a situation where you have adequate power resource capacity on site now, but you simply have to have these key loads that are not connected. So for example, previously HVAC wasn't required to be connected to the emergency power system or the alternate power source. That has explicitly now been included because temperature control has to be part of any plan. So this then means that you could rewire existing loads, assuming that you had the adequate support system and support all of what is needed. And simply, this is the arguably the least capital intensive. You don't get any operational expense benefits out of it, but you have the least capital expense up front, just simply rewiring your existing system. So if you have this opportunity, this is clearly best with respect to initial capital outlay. Option 2 is if you wish, you can add a conventional generator of some form, most typically being diesel, in part because of diesel fuel storage is well understood in the healthcare environment. And then you would have to develop a fuel resource plan. And I won't go into that very much, but you would either have to have 96 hours of fuel on site, or you would have to have a 6 hours minimum on site, and then a fuel delivery plan for those generators. And so, pardon me. The problem with this is the current lead times for generators are reportedly upwards of 70 weeks, and that depends, of course, on the type of generator, but there's a very limited population of generators that can be used in HCI-approved buildings because of seismic certification. This essentially is all cost and no return, meaning you have to pay for all the capital expense, but there's no savings, there's no direct benefits except under emergency circumstances. You do face significant regulatory headaches and costs, and we'll talk about that in a bit. And then there's, of course, the recurring O&M expense, operation and maintenance, that comes with diesel generators and the fuel resources. So then option 3 is to add a microgrid, and we won't spend a great deal of time defining that because we've talked about that previously, but just briefly, it's a congregation of a series of resources that are integrated together and controlled under one controller in service of a building, a campus, or whatever it might be. So that could be solar, wind, combined with batteries. There might be EV charging included, but in any case, it's all administered under a single controller to best utilize the power generated on site. In this case, with a microgrid, you would presumably need a dual purpose fuel resource. So for example, if you had within the microgrid a system that used natural gas, such as a fuel cell, the natural gas system will be forced to disconnect with seismic shutoff valves by law and by rule. So therefore, you would have to have a second resource of natural gas that could serve that fuel cell and be toggled over to adequate resource kept on site or delivered to the site, just as you would need with a diesel resource. So conventional generators represent, and this is a deeper dive into what we've been talking about. Conventional generators essentially represent cost only, and therefore are a stranded asset, something that you paid for that sits there and does not very much for the benefit of your facility or bottom line. So you have lots of costs, but I've just illustrated a few here. There's equipment acquisition, the fuel acquisition, and we've all been seeing tremendous price volatility of late, particularly in the natural gas environment. Fuel storage is a complication and difficulty for facilities that have a small footprint. There's, of course, all the construction, operation, and maintenance associated with that, which is not trivial. And then the testing and environmental reporting because of the restrictions in California for using fossil fuels. So the advantages of this is that it's an understood technology and it's highly reliable. And so those in the healthcare environment are comfortable with particularly diesel generators. The barriers are that, as we discussed, these are significantly backordered, and you might have a lot of difficulty even getting on the list to be ordered. You have problems with the Air Quality Management District and Air Resources Board. Cal OSHA has a say about fuel storage. The EPA has a say about how this is managed, and the California Energy Commission has some regulatory controls as well, and is certainly not disposed to support diesels as the solution. So this is, as far as incentives and productivity of the system, there's really none. And that's really important to make note of, because again, this represents cost and difficulties without any particular meaningful economic benefit, certainly. So in essence, it's a solution, but it's without yield to your facility or facilities. So we come to the opportunity for microgrids, and these represent high performance systems that have some return on investment in addition to meeting the requirements of the new regulations. So we still have costs associated with that. There's the equipment acquisition, there's fuel acquisition, similar to what you might have with the diesels. There is fuel storage of some sort, and then there's the maintenance of the systems. There really is very little testing and environmental reporting ongoing, because depending on the systems used within the microgrid, they're not subject to the same types of controls and reporting for example, diesel. Some of the barriers are getting equipment that's seismically certified, because there's certainly, we're very early in that process, and having a fully seismically certified system is challenging. Again, but we don't face the question of back ordering. That these systems are, to the extent that there are systems that have yet to be seismically certified, the systems are nonetheless available. There are really no Air Resource Board, Cal OSHA, EPA, or CEC barriers, other than insofar as if you chose to have fuel storage on site, you would have some needs to meet those standards. Now, where it really differs is in the world of incentives and productivity. So first of all, you have the opportunity to significantly reduce utility cost. And without diving deeply into that, you get the double duty of cutting down both your energy expense and what are called demand fees or peak load fees. And those can be substantial parts of your overall recurring cost. Second of all, depending on your facility, its location, the population it serves, and the systems that are used within a microgrid, you could qualify for as much as a 40 to 60% federal tax credit, income investment tax credit, that is, and between 75 to 80% accelerated depreciation, which is to say it's accelerate or depreciate over 5 years with significant front loading of that depreciation. So that's a big value up front. There are some self-generation incentive program dollars still available, but these are not entirely reliable, but they are a cash incentive that comes from the utilities via state program. And then finally, there's renewable energy credits and other attributes that if you don't want to be able to claim that you have green energy production, you can resell these in a marketplace and be paid for your solar productivity if you use solar, for example. So this is a solution that has many advantages as opposed to just the standard diesel approach. So in interest of showing you how this might perform, and again, I want to emphasize this is really just an illustration for your consumption, but not to say that this would necessarily be true in a given situation. Nonetheless, this is what a purchase of a generator might look like. So if we said, we'll take a small system and say, let's say you want to purchase a 25 kW system because that's the average load of facilities in California. And let's say for the sake of argument, you could do this for design and install for $100,000. That's admittedly a low price. I'm just using it for illustration. And then let's say that your operation and maintenance cost is $10,000 per year. That has more to do with the fuel and fuel storage and reporting and other soft costs that you might have to deal with. And then there's the regulatory costs that really honestly are very difficult to assess here and even to track because they come out of existing personnel or additional personnel that you might have to hire. Unfortunately, there's zero incentives for doing this. And at this point in time, no funding coming from the state or any other public entities to support this. And so the net initial cost in this scenario would be about $122,000. And the utility cost benefit, because you cannot run the diesel for any other purpose other than as an alternate source, is effectively zero ongoing. So it's also worth noting with the diesel solution that there's really no option for specialty financing. And we'll talk about this a little bit, but there's what's called PACE funding, on-bill finance, or even loans from the California Energy Commission, but none of these support diesel generator construction. So there are some problems with diesel fuel. It's great insofar as it has no explosive risk and it's well understood and there's a supply chain, et cetera. I don't mean to say that diesel isn't a perfectly well-trodden path that works just fine, but I've given you some information and the link to the website where I pulled this from, just to say that there's some real problems with the long-term storage of the fuel. And finally, down towards the end, you'll see that the National Fire Protection Association 110, Regulation 110 mandates monthly generator testing and an annual 2-hour full load bank test. So those come with expense and you have to have certified technicians, et cetera. Now, if we come to the microgrid, it's a little different scenario. In this case, we'll assume that the acquisition cost is quite a bit higher. It's more equipment, a little bit more complexity. Let's assume that the design and install is fairly similar in cost. And let's assume that the operation and maintenance cost is the same. I would argue it will probably be considerably less for the microgrid, but in interest of showing you reasonable parity, I wanted to show it as if it's the same. Regulatory cost is frankly de minimis. We have a couple of microgrids working and the regulatory requirements ongoing are essentially none. So the incentives here are important. There's a big tax credit that could be gotten from this, about $120,000 based on a 40% tax credit. The depreciation would be $240,000, again, front loaded to the first year, but playing out over 5 years. The self-generation incentive program could be upwards of $75,000. I would not rely upon that because a lot of those monies have been reserved or already depleted. So the system net cost could be anywhere from $27,000 to $100,000, but quite a lot less than what you would have predicted based on the equipment cost, for example, going into this. Now, what's important here and worthy of real discussion later is that with this system, a given facility could save as much as almost $33,000 a year on their utility energy cost, because this would be designed to operate continuously as well as to cut demand. So you really get the full value out of the system operationally, and yet it remains available for as an alternate source. So if you were to use leverage, which is to say some kind of outside financing, and there's many versions of this that we'll talk about, you could actually realize a profit from the microgrid as early as day zero, but certainly within the first 2 to 3 years, the system could essentially be saving you more money than you've expended, and now you're in the black as opposed to in the red with other types of approaches. So to go through this really quickly, and I'm not going to do a deep dive on the finance types, but I will give you some background here just so you have a vocabulary based on this. So there's the so-called PACE programs, or CPACE, because this is commercial, property assessed clean energy. Those can finance up to 100% of project cost. And that's worthy of mention. There's very few loans or very few forms of leverage you could find that will ever pay 100% of a project cost. So you almost always have to have skin in the game, and therefore capital expense. PACE actually allows you not to have to do that. It's not considered a loan legally. It's paid back on your property tax bill, and you can extend that over 20 years. And by the way, that is true for nonprofits as well. So even if you don't pay property taxes, but nonetheless have to file the appropriate paperwork, you can still pay this on the equivalent of a property tax bill. Interestingly enough, the lien for this money is against the property and not the company or individual. So the lien or the expense for this transfers to, if somebody buys the property, the lien transfers with the property and moves with the sale, and doesn't remain with the original company or individual that occupied or owned that facility. It is important to know that mortgages are subordinate to PACE. In other words, if you have a mortgage on your facility and you want to get a PACE loan, you would almost certainly have a clause in your mortgage contract that requires you to notify the bank, because they will be in second position for repayment in the event you become insolvent. There's also what's called on-bill financing, which is to say this is actually financing where someone else is paying for the project, and then you're paying back the loan on your utility bill. This again can cover up to 100% of costs. The utility finances it through special programs in California. It's repaid on your utility bill. It's at zero interest, and it's up to a 10-year term. However, it's limited to about $250,000 per project, although you can do multiple projects on any given site, up to $4 million total in on-bill financing. Little nuance, but different, is on-bill repayment, which is where you have a relationship between you, the utility, and a lender. The lender finances your project, usually with a conventional type of loan, but the loan is repaid through the utility bill. So it's a little complicated because you need a multi-party agreement, and the terms depend on the lender. But typically, this is considered a lower risk form of lending from lenders, and so often you can get better terms than a conventional loan. Finally, conventional loans, I won't beat this to death because you're almost certainly very knowledgeable about this, but you would certainly be limited on the percentage of the project that you could finance. It may be as much as 60 to 80%, but it could be quite a bit less than that. You're subject to market rates. It's almost always less than a 10-year term. Anything longer would be very unusual. And the business itself is collateral for that, which is to say it's not now attached necessarily to the project itself or the property, but to the actual business and any other assets the business might have. So the sources of value from the microgrid in specific are the immediate incentives, and those can be substantial depending on your facility. And then you have the ongoing site-based energy production and peak demand reduction. So those two aspects together can lead to you recovering whatever capital you do expend. And again, you may not need to expend any in this circumstance. And the net savings in operational expense returns cash to the business. And in a low margin business like healthcare, these dollars can be critical. And so you turn what is really a very stressful situation potentially into a significant positive. It's important to note that these incentives are only available for clean energy projects or energy efficiency. So in other words, if you wanted to go through a PACE or on-bill finance, et cetera, all of those require that this be a clean energy project. You could not do that with a conventional generator. So we've had people say to us, well, what if I can't use the tax credits or depreciation? So for example, you don't have enough income, or you're a nonprofit, or there's other reasons why tax credits and depreciation might not be useful. Well, there's a number of things that have changed about this in recent federal law that are worthy of discussion, because they really come into play here. So first, if you're a nonprofit, you are specifically called out as being able to use what's called a direct pay option. So for example, if you had a $100,000 project, a 40% tax credit, you could request from the IRS a cash payment of $40,000 with no other consequences to that, meaning that you just get paid cash, irrespective of whether you pay taxes at all or not. So as a nonprofit, you shouldn't be paying federal taxes, but whether or not you are, it doesn't matter. You can ask for the cash payment. If you have some use for the tax equity, but maybe you can't absorb it all, you don't have enough income to use all the tax credits, for example. Well, you have the option to carry the tax credits back as far as 3 years, and they're allowed to be carried forward for 22 years. Based on time value of money, carrying it forward that long is probably not the most sound decision, but because there's other options, but that is a way to ameliorate your tax burden for a considerable length of time. Now, if you don't want to do either of those things above, or for some reason are unable to, the new law does allow for a one-time sale or transfer to another entity. And what's notable about that is, right now, the marketplace is just emerging. This is a fairly new concept, and so nobody can say with clarity what the value of the tax credits will be at sale. But most of the folks I've talked to have been giving me a range of 90 to 95% of face value. Or if you had a $100,000 tax credit or $1 million tax credit, you would get 90,000 or 900,000, or upwards of 95,000 to 950,000. And what's even more important is this is explicitly not a federally taxable event. So the person selling it and reaping cash from that, or the entity reaping cash from that, does not have a federal tax burden, and the person purchasing it cannot write off the purchase. So does your facility qualify for this? Well, if you prefer to avoid full cash purchase, and we actually have run into some facilities that want to pay cash and are flush, and that's of course great for them and simplifies some matters. But if you're like most facilities and most companies and prefer not to use your cash, perhaps you have some capital and can utilize leverage, or just want to use leverage alone. So you have the option to do the PACE program. So again, that depends on your willingness to have this paid on your property tax assessment, and the other issues around subordination of your mortgage, et cetera. But that's a program specifically directed at this kind of thing. You could use governmental loans. So for example, the California Energy Commission offers a 1% loan program for this sort of thing that requires working with the CEC and an application process, and so has some complexity involved, but it's a low interest rate and of course very attractive. And then of course, if you wanted to go the route of a conventional lender because you have an outstanding relationship in that regard, then of course that's an easy opportunity for some facilities. Now, if you have no cash or cannot take any kind of debt of any kind, there are options for a third party to completely finance a project like this. They can then harvest the tax benefits, et cetera, which is essentially a buy down of their cost, and then sell services to you in what's called a power purchase agreement. So the essence of that is the facility saves money on their overall expenses from day one of the project, has no capital expense, and more or less has a fairly guaranteed process going forward with very little exposure to risk. But the facility or the ownership also doesn't have access to the tax benefits and write-offs. Okay, so what does this really look like if we were to sort of run an illustration? So let's look at this sort of being done with a $500,000 project. So this is a messy spreadsheet, but it's put up here to intentionally show you what this would look like if you're doing these calculations. So with the assumptions that you see in the upper left that I won't read to you, you can see the furnish and install price of $500,000 and a 60% loan in this case of $300,000 with its payback at a market interest rate. So this is not as favorable, by the way, as you would have with, for example, a PACE or on-bill finance loan for this scenario. And so you're welcome to read across as you wish for the purposes of the cash flows. But what you can see is that the net expenses are fairly quickly wiped out because of all the benefits and the savings related to this project. And in my way of thinking, and perhaps the most relevant thing is to look down at the bottom left, and where you see that this is essentially a simple payback period of less than 0.2 years. In other words, 20% of 1 year. The net present value, or what this looks like as a benefit to this particular company or owner, is like putting 1.17 million in your pocket on day one. And it's an internal rate of return of about 213% based on the capital expenditure. So naturally, if you expended zero, if this was 100% financed, the IRR would be infinite because you would have no dollars expended, but all return. So the cash on cash return is fairly outstanding in this scenario. Now, what if we look at instead the third party investor power purchase agreement illustration? So in this scenario, the cost of the project is largely irrelevant to the facility in the sense of someone else is bearing that cost and that risk, but also harvesting those tax benefits and the like. In this case, the facility has some charges it has to pay to the owner of the system, but still reaps a reasonably substantial savings every year and has a net present value of about $293,000. There's a zero simple payback because, again, the facility in this case or ownership is not financing it. And the internal rate of return is essentially infinite because you have no cash expenditure. So for some facilities that simply want to have someone else carry the project and administrate it and take whatever associated costs of operation are, this is a good tool, and it makes it quite simple to just pay a charge on the PPA and then have a much lower utility bill as a consequence. So we're coming down to the end of this. I just have a couple of thoughts as we close. So the renewable energy microgrids solution to this problem, if you will likely have lower significant net project costs due to significant incentives. And again, I didn't illustrate to you the most significant benefits that might occur in certain facilities because there have to be unique features. So if you're, for example, in a very low income, or not a very, but just in a low income area, or you happen to sit on tribal lands, or you are in what's called an energy community where a small percentage of the population has traditionally worked in the coal or gas or oil industry, these incentives skyrocket. So those are actually, those circumstances are even better than what I've showed here. These produce significant value from the energy and demand cost reduction because, of course, you're producing your own energy. If you have installed battery systems, those are used to manage your peak demand during the highest peak demand period. So take energy from your own generation, shift it to the time that it's most valuable, and really significantly cut those costs. And then you avoid a lot of the current and future regulatory headaches. So, a brief comment about Faraday and Mazzetti, as we've collaborated on some of the most innovative breakthrough microgrids in the country. And we urge you, by the way, to contact us. We're more than happy to give tours of the installations up at Kaiser Permanente in Richmond, or our soon-to-be commissioned project at Kaiser, Ontario. And certainly we can give you a virtual tour or discuss those. But as a consequence of this and other factors, these two teams are recognized experts in design, engineering, construction, and operation. And we also have direct experience with ownership, tax credits, and depreciation, as we own and operate some of these facilities as well, and have had to step through these issues for more than the past decade. So we urge you to try to find the right solution for your facilities. We understand that this is a difficult time for skilled nursing facilities, as it's this unfunded mandate places a great deal of pressure, particularly on those low margin healthcare facilities that are looking for solutions or concerned about their solvency going forward. We would be more than delighted to take your calls, but you can also look at our respective websites to gain more information about microgrids. And so with that, I'll conclude my presentation, and we can move on to a discussion and answering some of your questions.
Dave, it looks like we have, I think it's Paulina. Paulina, I'll unmute you. You have your hand raised, so you can ask your question.
And you may need to unmute yourself, Paulina.
It would appear so.
Or Jess, are you able to unmute her remotely?
It appears that she is unmuted from my end.
Okay.
But I think.
Well, while Paulina is sorting that, I'll get to a couple questions from one of the folks in the group. By the way, I won't identify who's asked the questions unless you, for some reason, wish me to. So one person asked for who applies for the tax incentives. Is it the microgrid contractor? So no, the owner of the system is who applies for the tax credit, but it actually isn't an application. The tax credits automatically accrue once the system is placed in service. So that means the first day that it is operational, as long as it remains operational for 5 years, the tax credits and the depreciation hit. And so there's no certification required. There's no inspection for this purpose. There's no documentation. It just goes on the taxes of the entity that owns it. And that includes, by the way, if a contractor builds this and sells it to a party, whoever buys it and finally owns it is at its outset is who claims those credits. Second question was, do you know if HUD finance facilities would also have access to PACE programs? To my knowledge, there's no exclusion for federally financed healthcare facilities. The PACE programs only specify that it be in certain areas of the country. In this case, California is covered in its entirety, but other parts of the country, it's patchy. In this case, the C-PACE programs require that it be commercial. And then there's other it's not tied to who owns the facility or what resources the facility bills to, so much as if it's a facility that meets the other program requirements, like the likelihood of paying back. So not everyone is accepted, but the likelihood is far higher than it is with conventional lending, because again, it's collateralized against the property, which is and put in first position, and also the data is that repayment on bills like your property tax or utility, people are more likely to repay those than they are on conventional bills. And so statistically, you're a lower risk environment if you're paying back on one of those bills. People tend to prioritize those over paying things like loans and mortgages, interestingly enough. Okay, I think I've gotten to those questions. I want to make sure no one else on has other questions or comments. We'll give people a moment. And here we are. Okay, so we have an Olympian 125 kW generator and a 75 gallon capacity, which would serve 19 hours. We're allowed to have 130 gallons of fuel on site, which is a total of 32 hours. We have contract with Geiger to provide as needed fuel in an emergency situation, remaining 64 hours. Would this fulfill compliance? So I've had this discussion with many folks, and with the caveat that I'm speaking to you wearing the hat of a contractor as opposed to as a regulator, albeit I do sit on this hospital building safety board. So long as your facility has all of the required loads connected to your alternate power source. So in other words, if you've already connected your whole facility, or if you've connected these new key loads, so for example, HVAC, or at least environmental temperature control, because the rule is going to be, it has to be 71 to 81 degrees in the occupied spaces. So if you have all of those supported and you can meet the requirements, then you appear to be all set, as I interpret what you've written here. And so to be more specific, again, with the caveat of being able to support all the required loads, you're actually only required to have 6 hours of on-site fuel, and the remaining 90, you have to have a supply contract for, or a method to obtain that HCI determines to be reliable. So you appear to be far ahead of the vast majority of folks, and very well situated, again, so long as you're wired for support appropriately. But that's a great question. Thank you. And I appreciate the illustration. It's a really good one for people to hear. So just making sure no one else has other questions. We don't want to end too early and have anyone feel that we're cutting them short, but we also want to be respectful of people's time. And I guess I'm always appreciative when webinars are quick. So I'll give it a couple more minutes while people think about if they have any additional questions. While I'm waiting, I will tell you that there's a lot of thought and a lot of concern about what may evolve with this law and whether or not there will be any modifications. I've talked to a few experts, and what the experts are being told is the governor is in full support of the law as it's currently written, and that the legislature is not likely and currently has no plans to take up any modifications of the law as it's currently written. So as much as I think many people are hoping that there will be some additional modifications or changes or even new legislation, that doesn't seem to be imminent, and maybe something that if it happens will be in the distant future. That presents a big challenge because of the deadline of January 1st. I will say one nuance that has perhaps gone missed previously that may be beneficial to some of you is that HCI has said, and I think it's also in their PIN, is that an adequate plan will have to be in place, which is to say the method to support the facility with a reasonable and achievable method to make that happen. And they haven't put time boundaries around that yet. So in other words, it's not clear that if you had that accepted by HCI, that you would have unlimited time. I'm certain there will be a time boundary placed on that, but that may be a way to be able to not have to be have a fully functional system by January 1st, because few of us believe that that's achievable given the remaining time frame. But that said, there are some places that could move quite quickly. So I encourage you to go on the HCI website, because there is a form or forms and applications that you will need to fill out for your facility to start the process of engaging with HCI and getting the approvals for your plan or where you might want to go, but also for getting direction on how you might handle matters. So I think, let me just check the chat and make sure that there's no other questions. Okay, so just to recap really quickly before we close, you have a few different options for how to finance these projects. Naturally, you could go with cash, and that's certainly an option to anybody if they have that kind of cash, with the caveat that that's a fairly significant outlay with delayed returns, or at least returns over time with the microgrid, and of course no real returns with the diesels. The second option is to do this with external funding, which is to say have a third party finance the entire project, own and operate it, and sell services to the facility. And this gives you a significant amount of savings without any obligations to manage the system, but also takes away the other incentives that flow to the owner of those systems. Or lastly, you can choose one of several methods to fund the system up to 100% of the entire cost through specific funding methods for microgrids and similar systems only. In other words, that don't apply to diesels. And those are things like the property assessed clean energy program, on-bill financing, on-bill repayment. And actually there's others. So for example, I mentioned governmental funding through the CEC that can defray either a significant amount or the entire amount of this cost. And so the consequential savings are essentially 100% benefit as opposed to costing a great deal of money up front. So if you have questions, please reach out to us. We'd be more than delighted to examine your individual circumstance or portfolio of facilities if you wish, and we are at your disposal. Oh, sorry, here comes a question. What percentage of facilities already comply with the regs without having to upgrade? I don't think HCI has data on that. We've talked about that, and it is probably a very small percentage, in large measure because there was not a precedent before this to connect things like environmental systems, HVAC. So many facilities had quite reasonably and in compliance with the regulations, not connected those things. But at this point, I don't think anyone has any meaningful data. Part of what HCI is doing with the application process through the website is to gather that kind of information to both inform HCI about what's been done to date and also how facilities have already prepared for this. To my knowledge, I have not yet seen a facility other than the one that was brought to me in this question here on today's webinar that is fully compliant. So that's the first one I've seen. But that doesn't mean there aren't many. They just may not be making much noise about it because they're already compliant. Okay. Well, I very much appreciate, we all appreciate your time. And again, I want to thank you to the Mazzetti team and to Goalpost for helping us, and to my team at Faraday Microgrids. And thank you all for taking part of your busy day to come participate in our webinar. This will be uploaded for people's viewing subsequently, and you should be able to get information at our respective websites. Again, thank you very much for your time, and we'll end early. Thank you.